Hello and welcome to One India. This is World News. Tonight, power, pressure, and the redrawing of global fault lines. From Washington's unprecedented move to monetize Venezuela's oil after the dramatic capture of its longtime strongman Nicolás Maduro, to the quiet but decisive military tools that made it possible, and the high-stakes geopolitical squeeze now being applied on Caracas. Let's begin with Washington. US President Donald Trump has unveiled a plan that sharply escalates Washington's control over post-Maduro Venezuela. Under the proposal, Venezuela will hand over between 30 to 50 million barrels of oil to be sold directly by the United States. Trump says the proceeds will benefit both the Venezuelan people and the American interests, framing the move as economic stabilization after last week's dramatic operation that led to the capture and removal of President Nicolás Maduro. But Caracas is pushing back. Here's why.
Today's big development. The United States is set to receive up to 50 million barrels of oil from Venezuela at market price. The announcement came directly from President Donald Trump on his social media platform. He said that Venezuela's interim authorities will be selling between 30 and 50 million barrels of what he called high-quality oil. Trump also added that he has instructed Energy Secretary Chris Wright to carry out this plan immediately. According to his post, the oil will be transported by storage ships and delivered straight to unloading docks in the United States. Now here's a key detail. Trump said the money generated from the oil sale would be controlled by him as president, but would be used to benefit both the people of Venezuela and the United States. So what's happening behind the scenes? The White House is reportedly planning a meeting in the Oval Office with major oil company executives, including Exxon, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips. This suggests the administration is moving quickly to understand how this Venezuelan oil could be integrated into the U.S. energy market. Venezuela, remember, sits on around 1/5 of the world's oil reserves. But analysts warn, rapidly boosting production won't be easy. The country faces aging infrastructure, economic problems, and political uncertainty. All of those could slow down any increase in exports. And that political backdrop is important because separately, tensions remain high inside Venezuela. Interim President Delcy Rodriguez has pushed back strongly against Trump's claim that the U.S. is now in charge of Venezuela during the political transition. Rodriguez said clearly, "The government of Venezuela is in charge in our country and no one else." She has struck a mixed tone recent days, sometimes sounding open to dialogue, other times defiantly rejecting U.S. pressure. All this comes after U.S. Special Forces captured former leader Nicolás Maduro and his wife in Caracas in a dramatic operation preceded by airstrikes. Venezuela's military has now released its first official casualty figures, 23 troops killed, including 5 generals. Cuba, a key ally, reported 32 Cuban military deaths, several of them senior officers. The number of civilian casualties still unclear. The Venezuelan Attorney General has spoken of dozens of civilian and military dead, without providing an exact breakdown. So, what does all this mean? On one hand, the U.S. could soon be receiving tens of millions of barrels of oil, potentially easing market pressures. On the other, Venezuela remains politically fragile, militarily tense, and economically strained. The key questions now are: Will this oil deal stabilize the situation or deepen the political divide? And how quickly, if at all, can Venezuela ramp up production to meet commitments? We'll keep watching developments as the geopolitical and economic stakes continue to rise.
The US operation against Maduro did not rely on strategy alone. Behind the scenes, a key role was played by one of the most advanced electronic warfare aircraft in the US arsenal, the EA-18G Growler. Designed to blind, jam, and dominate enemy communications, the Growler has become Pentagon's go-to platform in modern hybrid warfare, where control of the electromagnetic spectrum is just as decisive as boots on the ground. Here's a closer look.
Imagine a warplane that doesn't fire bombs or shoot missiles, yet plays one of the most crucial roles in a high-stakes military operation. Meet the EA-18G Growler, the U.S. Navy's electronic warfare jet that helped clear the skies over Venezuela and made it possible for U.S. forces to capture President Nicolás Maduro. Unlike typical fighter jets, the Growler doesn't punch holes in enemy defenses, it blinds them. Its mission is all about controlling the invisible battlefield, the electromagnetic spectrum. It listens to hostile radar and communication signals. Then it replies back with noise and false information. The result? Enemy radar goes haywire, screens fill with fake targets, or lose track of real aircraft entirely. This protects friendly jets, helicopters, and drones by stopping surface-to-air missiles from locking on. In simple terms, the Growler doesn't fight with bullets, it fights with signals. In the early hours of January 3, 2026, the U.S. launched Operation Absolute Resolve, a massive air and special forces mission targeting Venezuelan air defenses and leading to the capture of Nicolás Maduro. Here's where the Growler shined. It jammed and confused Venezuela's radar and communications, especially older Soviet and Russian-made defense systems, making them ineffective at tracking incoming U.S. aircraft. It created a safe corridor in the sky, letting helicopters and special ops jets come and go with fewer risks. This electronic blanket helped U.S. forces operate with precision and surprise. It wasn't alone. Stealth fighters, bombers, drones, and early warning aircraft supported the mission, but without the Growler's signal warfare, the skies would have been far more dangerous. What makes the Growler special? The EA-18G Growler is built by Boeing and is based on the familiar FA-18 Super Hornet, but don't be fooled, it's redesigned from the ground up for electronic dominance. Electronic jamming pods. These detect enemy radar and send back false information. Signal deception systems. They make hostile defense systems see things that aren't there or lose sight of real targets. Anti-radiation missiles. Although it's not a bomber, it can fire weapons that home in on radars to knock them out of action. Two-person crew. One pilot and one electronic warfare officer, like having an extra brain in the sky focused purely on digital combat. Why electronic warfare is the future? Electronic warfare used to be an afterthought, but recent conflicts, from Ukraine to Venezuela, have shown that controlling the invisible battlefield is often the key to victory. No explosions, no firepower, just silence and control. That's the Growler's power.
Now, with Maduro gone and a new interim government in place, Washington is now tightening the screws. President Trump reportedly wants Venezuela's new leadership to sever economic and strategic ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba before being allowed to expand oil production. The message is blunt: partner exclusively with the United States or remain locked out of the global energy markets. Watch this report.
So, the United States just told Venezuela's new leadership Kick out China and Russia, or we treat you like Maduro. Yeah, that's the hook. Let's unpack what's really going on here. On January 3, 2026, the U.S. carried out a military operation that captured former Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. And after that operation, the Trump administration laid out a new deal: normalize relations, open the door to oil, but first cut ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. Which sounds simple, except it really isn't. Because what the U.S. is asking for isn't just a diplomatic shift, it's a total geopolitical realignment. Venezuela would have to expel foreign advisors, end joint oil projects, and shut out the very countries keeping its economy alive. And all of this is being presented to interim President Delcy Rodriguez, who, by the way, used to be Maduro's vice president. So why is the U.S. pushing this so hard? Think of Venezuela as a massive oil vault. It has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, nearly 300 billion barrels. But under Maduro and heavy U.S. sanctions, Venezuela turned to China and Russia for survival, loans, military support, oil deals, political backing. And that created something Washington hates: America's rivals gaining influence in America's backyard. So now, with Maduro gone, Washington sees a reset button. But here's the problem: Venezuela is deeply, and I mean deeply, financially tied to China. Since 2007, China has poured in over $60 billion in loans. Venezuela still owes between 10 and 19 billion, and most of that debt is repaid in oil. Right now, around 80% of Venezuela's oil exports go to China. So if Venezuela kicks China out, the money stops, the oil stops, the repayments stop, and suddenly you're looking at defaults, lawsuits, asset seizures, frozen tankers, maybe even oil refineries abroad getting targeted in court. Russia is also in the mix, but in a more strategic way: oil joint ventures, military advisors, equipment, loans tied to projects. So, add it all up, Venezuela sits on $150 to $170 billion of external debt, one of the highest debt loads in the world. So when the U.S. says, yeah, just cut China and Russia loose, they're really saying, walk away from the only lifelines keeping your economy from total collapse. And that brings us to the other side of the story. China and Russia won't just shrug and walk away. China could push for repayment, seize overseas assets, shift oil buying elsewhere, or quietly ramp up support for anti-US governments in Latin America. Russia could pull military support, apply pressure with debt, or step up covert operations, cyber campaigns, weapons flows, proxy groups. Not a full-scale war, more like strategic annoyance. So, what does Venezuela do? Right now, interim President Delcy Rodriguez is calling the U.S. raid military aggression. She's a Maduro loyalist. Her entire political world was built around Chavista ideology, which is anti-U.S. at its core. Meanwhile, opposition leaders want democracy, but they don't control the state. So, Venezuela is stuck between two massive forces pulling in opposite directions. The U.S. says, align with us and we unlock the oil economy. China and Russia say, stay with us and we keep your system alive. Either choice is destabilizing.
And now a direct challenge at sea. Russia has dispatched a naval escort to protect a Venezuelan oil tanker attempting to break the U.S. blockade amid fears that Washington may seize the vessel. The tanker, now called Marinera, is part of Venezuela's so-called shadow fleet, vessels accused of transporting sanctioned oil. Formerly named Bella 1, it has been hastily rebranded and even painted with a Russian flag, a clear signal of Moscow's involvement. This is no longer just economic warfare. It is a live test of power, deterrence, and escalation between nuclear-armed rivals. Take a look.
In a dramatic escalation of global sanctions enforcement, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth proudly announced the seizure of a Russia-flagged oil tanker, the Marinera, in the North Atlantic, calling it a major victory in Washington's campaign against illicit oil trade. The tanker, once known as Bella 1, had been on the run for more than 2 weeks after evading a U.S. blockade of Venezuelan oil exports and refusing to let the U.S. Coast Guard board it. It sailed north across the Atlantic, changed its name to Marinera, and even adopted a Russian flag, a clear attempt to avoid seizure. Posting the capture on social media, Hegseth, now styled as Secretary of War under the Trump administration, declared that the blockade of sanctioned oil tankers is in full effect anywhere in the world. He portrayed the operation as part of a larger effort to cut off revenue flowing to sanctioned networks and destabilize illicit oil routes. This wasn't just another oil seizure, it was the U.S. boarding and taking control of a Russian-flagged civilian ship marked by a federal court warrant for sanctions violations and a coordinated operation by the U.S. Coast Guard and military forces in international waters. Russia condemned the action as piracy and formally protested, arguing that the ship was legally registered under its flag. Moscow even dispatched naval assets, including a submarine, to the region as tensions simmered. The Marinera operation highlights an assertive U.S. stance on enforcing sanctions tied to Venezuela and shadow fleet oil networks, a willingness to seize foreign-flagged vessels in international waters, causing real friction with Russia amid geopolitical battles over energy and influence. Secretary of War Hegseth's celebratory tone and the high-profile seizure of a Russia-flagged civilian vessel underline how far the U.S. is willing to go to clamp down on sanctioned oil trafficking and how those actions could redraw lines in global power struggles at sea.
So, Venezuela has become the latest arena where oil, force, and geopolitics collide. The question now is not whether global powers will intervene, but how far they are willing to go to enforce their version of order. That's world news for you. Thanks for watching.